Peter Sellers discusses his insights into the profound history behind Dr. Atomic and how opera can grapple with complex moral issues.
Because people come to the Santa Fe Opera from all over the world, it is a moment to just say, okay, let's convene everybody and let's look at this. I think the question right now is the future of New Mexico.
Los Alamos is right over there.
Because the atomic world is not the past, it's the future here, and that New Mexico could be a front runner in actually a different set of life choices. I think this opera has a role to play in that conversation. Opera is a way you bring many communities together into one place, and you deal with something absolutely crucial to the future of the human race. You actually are engaging in an anthropological survival ritual, which is there are certain things we need to talk about, and we need to talk about them in a way that goes beyond politics, that goes beyond psychology, that goes beyond all the ways we have of reducing and compartmentalizing everything, and say, no, if a generation of young people are committing suicide, we have to come together and talk about that. That's painful. You know, you can't just make new legislation that will fix that. It's a deeper human question that we all need to face together, and we need to face it from as many different angles, points of view, and ways of understanding it as possible, because our current ways of understanding it are just not good enough. So you make an art form that is about composite reality, because reality is composite. And you have poetry and music and dance and visual art, and you have multiple cultures represented, multiple art forms represented to deal with the multiplicity of human experience. And so opera is kind of sublime in its attempt to just touch something that is like a totality and make something powerful enough to engage people from all these different spectrums of a society.
When you worked on the libretto for Dr. Atomic with composer John Adams, what about the subject matter captured your imagination?
You know, there's something Homeric about this thing. The creation of the atomic bomb, the creation of the atomic era is going to echo down in human history for millennia. It's not a story for this week or next week or last week. It's a story that the human race is going to be dealing with 4 millennia from now. That's really powerful. We're dealing with something that the half-life and the afterlife doesn't quit. And each generation is going to ask themselves, how did this happen? Asking how this happened deeply, and using an art form that doesn't need to be quote-unquote successful, right? I mean, we're not selling anything. We don't have to, nobody has to vote for us. We can do what artists are meant to do, which is go into a zone of controversy and insist on a deeper discussion and not just come out with platitudes or simple ways of saying something. You know, the old Einstein thing of everything should be stated just as simply as possible and no simpler.
How did you go about the creative process? So much has been written about the Manhattan Project.
There is so much that has yet to be understood, opened, and talked about honestly. Now, one of the beautiful things about music is music you can explore difficult areas of the human psyche and motives and hopes and dreams, because music takes you there. And you don't have to get aggressive about it. You know, the bomb itself is already an aggressive story. So can we ratchet that down and look at it more quietly with more insight? So for example, one of the most important things for me was that Hiroshima does not appear on stage. You cannot make art out of atrocity. something should never be presented as something aesthetic. I'm sorry. That has to remain in its category of unspeakable. What you can do, and that's why we focused on the 24 hours into the first atomic test, the first time a bomb was exploded in Alamogordo in New Mexico. And just said, okay, what is that 24-hour period? The whole world knows what happens a week later in Hiroshima. But I can't put that on stage because art cannot go there. What we can put on stage is what do human beings think they're doing? And what are the stories they tell themselves as they're undertaking certain things? What was the pressure that created the culture of this atomic age? So, what was the Cold War doing? It was the first Cold War gesture was the explosion of this bomb. And meanwhile, what was the imperative of defeating the Nazis, defeating the Japanese? In what way is this a gesture of freedom, or in what way was this a gesture of an era that was not interested in freedom, but was interested in world domination? Can I put it that way?
Sure. What part of the historical account did you base the libretto on, and why was that important to you?
Well, the text of the opera is entirely things people actually said and did. And so it's great because a lot of declassified documents are now set to music by John Adams. And I'm very thrilled that something the US government did not want you to hear has been set for orchestra and chorus and it's going to be shouted from the mountaintops. That's thrilling. I mean, it's wonderful to be able to sing out aloud official secrets. That's in there, and that's kind of thrilling. But also, Oppenheimer and some of these people are subjects of multiple biographies and multiple reminiscences and so on. So there's a lot of interesting material. The filmmaker John Elfs made a great film called The Day After Trinity, interviewing, while they were still alive, the key scientists, and he let me use his outtakes. And so a lot of what some of these gentlemen thought at the very end of their lives has made it into this libretto. Meanwhile, Oppenheimer was obsessed with poetry, and he and his wife, Kitty, trying to evade the 24-hour surveillance that they were under, communicated to each other with phrases from Baudelaire poems.
In French, or?
Which totally did have the effect of confusing their security detail. And so I have a lot of Baudelaire in there, which is appropriate for the dark, strange, surreal level that was daily life here. Meanwhile, also, of course, he was reading the Bhagavad Gita. He knew Sanskrit. So that's in there. And meanwhile, I needed a voice for the women because the women were just being good wives and zipped their lips. And we really still have never heard the story of the wives. So I needed another source, and I used the mid-century poet Muriel Rukeyser, who went to school with the Oppenheimers in the School of Ethical Culture in New York City on the West Side. And she has a voice that you can really hear for Kitty. And she was also quite fearless. So the libretto was all of these things that were swimming in the air. And of course, the Trinity test site was named by Oppenheimer from a John Donne poem, which is Batter My Heart, Three-Person God.
You use that in the opera.
Exactly. I mean, because these things were on Oppenheimer's mind. These are like to ask, what was this man thinking? Where was he coming from? What was the internal drama and struggle in the midst of this overwhelming moment in human history? You have to go to these sacred sources. You have to go to something that's larger than a newspaper interview. You have to go to something that, what is somebody actually wrestling with in their soul as they're unleashing the greatest death force in the history of the planet.
Are there cultural and historical issues to take into account when you're doing this opera in New Mexico?
The thrill is finally doing this opera in Santa Fe, finally doing this opera in New Mexico. So we don't have to make a set that says New Mexico, we're here. You can see Los Alamos out the back door of the theater. It's fantastic. And the landscape is telling its own story eloquently. The San de Cristos Mountains are so moving, have that incredible, blood red sunset that the audience sees here. You can't miss the emotional intensity and beauty of the desert as a spiritual location. And it's very, very, very moving just to be here, just to taste this landscape as we tell this story. And very, very thrillingly, we will be working with scientists from Los Alamos and with Indians from the Pueblos, and doing some deep history and moving into personal dimensions. I think it's always, Los Alamos has such a kind of thrillingly active and positive self-image, but also the world hardly recognizes it as a community of people. Because as soon as you say scientist, sort of the word person goes away. You want to say, well, scientists are people. and that's actually what's interesting. And so to involve scientists right now, where the ethical issues right now have not changed, to involve Native Americans whose actually stewardship of the planet comes from a very different set of understandings, is extremely powerful. And to really engage those dialogues in our generation now and say, okay, this is what they did in 1945, but now what are we doing in the 21st century? What is our vision of how we take care of this planet? That's very powerful. And so this opera will be the occasion to move into those conversations, I think, very powerfully.
Do you think some of the scientists will take exception to the opera?
We worked very intensely with physicists, and physicists have come forward and been incredibly helpful in the making of this. We got one piece of science wrong, and we were told that really in a way that you couldn't miss. They were very clear about that. On the other hand, what we were, in fact, it came from something that the scientists themselves had published 1 month after Hiroshima. And it's now physics that has been shown to be out of date. So that has been eliminated. But otherwise, we have a pretty clean bill of health from nuclear physicists. It's been a real moment of really coming to terms, looking back and saying, oh, let's take another look. Let's maybe think through this again. That's been fantastic.
Why is it important to share these stories with new audiences?
Well, as always, something happens in the world that's going to be strictly temporary, and then it turns out to change the entire world forever. This is the Atomic Project. It's not the same world. Mm-hmm. And so many ways of understanding our world changed forever on the night this bomb was exploded. And I think the people making the bomb, in many cases, had a short-term goal in mind. We have to defeat the Nazis. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Someone had fled from Germany.
Okay, and so absolutely it's understood that the people working on it were working on deadline. And as you know, as a reporter, when you're on deadline, you don't always think about a larger context. You're just trying to say, I have to make deadline. This was a project that had to make deadline, and just made deadline by days. So now, several generations later, we look on a world they could not have imagined, that in fact they created. So the subject matter just gets more interesting, not less interesting. And you don't want to reduce it to a little historical anecdote, because it's not our history, it's our future. Nukes are our future. And until we deal with that, as a community, as a nation, and as a global, coming together at a global level, we are absolutely shortchanging the human race. So the project of the 21st century is to really deepen and open our understanding and come to some new set of consensus.
What do you want the audience to take away?
Well, what music can do and poetry can do and dance can do and all those things is just a sheer visceral, immersive experience which goes beyond the rational. It hits you, and that's the thrill of opera. When opera hits you, it just hits you, and it's overwhelming and exhilarating and terrifying and beautiful and unbelievably memorable. And that's what you hope for. and when the thrill of opera is because it's so complex, no two people have the same experience. And that's fantastic. So it's not like a documentary film where the filmmaker said, I want them to leave thinking of the following 3 points. Opera just doesn't work that way. Opera's like so out there, so touching parts of you that nothing else can touch. And so your responses are really surprising to yourself, let alone to your friends. And that's the thrill of opera. Opera, you're in some amazing, emotional, metaphysical freefall that suddenly everything that's unthinkable, you're suddenly thinking about. Everything that you didn't know how to respond to, you're suddenly having a lot of emotions. And so for me, the thrill of opera as a project is the unexpected reaction and emotions that people didn't know they had. And this project, again, when you're telling an epic story, forgive me for saying it, it doesn't reduce to television. It actually needs a kind of scope. And it doesn't reduce to film, because film, you can watch perfectly calmly a screen that doesn't need you to live or die. The movie's gonna keep spooling, and you're watching something that's just on a screen. But opera, we're all in the same room. Our hearts are all beating at the same time. We're all in a place that we have to take care of together. We all have to take responsibility as parts of a real present community. And that's not a movie. That's not watching television. That's a gathering of people and saying, wow, what do we have in common? That music is what that's about.
Why was this project so important for you to pursue?
I think when we look at the world now and we think so many things are out of control, we think, it's very easy to get very dark about a lot of things right now, and about governments doing things that, have appalling, unbelievably destructive consequences, but nobody's called to account. Nobody's asking, wait a minute, how did this happen? And meanwhile, what are we now doing next about this? Those conversations get buried, or don't happen at all, or happen in corridors, but don't happen in the organized way they need to. And again, because we're surrounded by endless public relations campaigns about everything. How do we reach into the heart, not only of the issue, but into our own hearts? The news of our lifetimes has been presented to us in such an impersonal way. Television news has to, quote unquote, be objective. Well, excuse me, what? That's one thing physics showed, is that there's no such thing as observer, you're the participant observer.
Heisenberg uncertainty principle.
At this moment, we have to say to all of humanity, you're not just watching this, you're in it. What music does is say, you're in it. And now, let's take action together.